guys for being here. That was a mouthful, huh? So we're going to talk about the brain, and I'm going to try and keep it interesting. The talk is about your plastic brain, so we're going to go through a lot of interesting ideas, but they're really pretty straightforward. And the morning sessions today are to get you into brain science and thinking about your own brain, and you're going to build a brain in about 45 minutes from now. So we're going to see how that works. When you go up there, you'll be learning how to play the game. I'll teach you how to do that. And you'll also be getting our little plastic brain from the Conti Center. And hopefully you'll think about it when you take it home and talk to your parents about what you learned today. I think the most important thing I want to convey is, how are you different from your parents? So when I ask that to my middle school kids, my own kids, they tell me they have more hair than I do, which is pretty disappointing. But actually the real difference is what's under the hair, right? So your brain is still very much what we call plastic. It's able to learn all kinds of new skills and new talents that your parents sadly have passed through and are unable to learn as easily, if at all. And so your brain is considered more sponge-like, more malleable, and we use the word in the professional field, plastic. Okay? And so like clay, it can be molded by experiences, good ones and bad ones. And so I thought we'd start with an experiment to convey this idea that early life is a time, we call them critical periods, right? It's an important time for you guys to learn new skills, because this is the time your brain is most receptive to wiring up and being able to do these things. And so we all know about genes. I hope you've had some biology, right? You're born into the world with a brain that looks roughly the same, one person to the next. But it's what happens to that brain after that makes each one of us so unique, right? You're all here in Massachusetts learning English, for example, but if you were born in China, for example, you would have a very different environment. And that environment acts on the same brain and turns it into a machine that can speak Chinese. And ultimately, that's the way in which our behaviors are shaped early on. And it becomes much harder to change those things as we get older. And so, just to give you the technical term and get it out of the way, critical periods are time windows when you really need to have certain kinds of experiences. Or said another way, if you don't have those experiences, those brain regions suffer and functions suffer. And we'll talk a little bit about that. So just to give you an idea of how your brain is a highly integrated machine, I'm going to try this and hope the sound is working. We had to switch computers at the last minute. This is an illusion, okay? You're going to hear an auditory illusion, and I can play it twice if you don't get it the first time. But you can download this from YouTube yourself later and check it out if you want. It's an auditory illusion called the McGurk effect. So let's see if it's...
Watch this experiment. It's called the McGurk effect.
Ba, 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 ba.
What do you think he's saying? If you think he's saying da, 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 you are in the grand majority. But now, close your eyes and listen instead of watching.
Ba, 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 ba.
The voice is saying ba, ba, ba. Now, let's replay it without the sound. Yes, it's true. His lips are saying ga, ga, ga. So how is it that when the lips are saying ga, 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 and the sound says ba, 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 that our brains read da, da, da? The McGurk effect. It's an example of an auditory illusion. It's a great way to show that the accurate perception of information can involve the participation of more than one sensory system. In this case, vision with sound. We call it multimodal perception. The McGurk effect. It's a terrific example of the fact that the senses did not evolve in isolation from each other, but actually work together to help us perceive our world. When multiple senses are stimulated simultaneously, the brain begins to experience an information-rich learning experience and laps it up like ice cream. It encodes more information per unit time, and it remembers that information better, too.
All right, is everyone able to hear that? Did you get that illusion? So he was saying ba, ba, ba the whole time. But when you put it together with the visual information that doesn't match, your brain hears something that he's not even saying. That's pretty impressive. And this effect was found by accident by a fellow named McGurk. And it turns out that it's something that's very sensitive to your early life experience. So I don't know if you know someone who's had a hearing impairment or was born deaf. If you don't get auditory experience in the first 2 years of life, then fix their hearing, which is now possible these days to fix their ear or provide a cochlear implant. They can hear sounds, but they will never be able to see that illusion or hear that illusion in the same way, because the first 2 years of life has shaped their brain to use the visual information more than the auditory information. And that's an example of many such critical period type phenomena. And so we learn how to see, we learn how to hear, we learn how to speak languages, we learn all kinds of complex motor skills through experiences which happen at important times in life. So here you see a graph of these critical periods which start very early at birth. In fact, hearing starts before you're born. Did you know that you can actually hear through your mom's belly when you're in the womb? And that's already shaping what language your brain is getting ready to hear, right? The rhythm of English is quite different from the rhythm of French or Japanese, and that's starting to set the stage. And so, interestingly, while your brain is still very plastic, in the case of hearing, it's even more plastic in those first few months around birth, right? And so, an experiment was done by Pat Poole, who studies language in kids. And she brought in American kids in Seattle, where she works, to play with a Chinese teacher for 30 minutes, just 3 times a week for a month. So if you do the math, it's about 5.5 hours, a short amount of time, where they were able to hear Chinese as 9-month-old babies. So they're not even really speaking yet, right? They may be babbling a little. And what she found was that American kids who wouldn't otherwise hear Chinese, getting this little bit of exposure at this optimal time made their brain able to hear Chinese just as well as Chinese kids growing up in China. That's how powerful this plasticity can be. And she did an interesting control experiment where she just videotaped the teachers and showed the videotape to the kids. And those kids didn't learn the Chinese sounds as well. And so the way in which we teach these things, as early as 9 months of age, can make a big difference. But that's just the ability to hear those sounds, right? Language is very complicated. You're able to speak, you're able to form sentences that are grammatically correct, use vocabularies that are always growing larger, and in fact, people have studied the more complex aspects of language and taken pictures of the brain. I'll tell you more about this in a second, but they looked at people who learned a second language. How many of you are learning a second language? Great, terrific. So these people looked inside the brains of living human adults who learned a second language after the age of 11, and they found that in particular language parts of the brain, the first, or native language in red, activated a different spot in the brain than the language they learned after the age of 11. And then they looked at people who grew up speaking 2 languages, and they found that the very same spot in the brain was activated by both. And so these are the first tantalizing hints that, in fact, when we learn things, might shape the way our brains are wired up. And so starting early might be important if your goal is to be fluent in multiple languages or to efficiently process certain sensory input in a way that is very natural and automatic. And so for the teachers in the room, it is kind of interesting that in most countries, second language learning starts pretty late. And in fact, in the US, it starts almost too late, right? if you want to wire up your brain to be optimal second language speakers. So we're going to talk a little bit about what's going on in the brain. And you had great questions, and so I'm trying to answer several of these along the way. What's going on inside your brain? It's an incredibly complex machine. And so there are a lot of ways to talk about it and make analogies, but I want to show you the real brain, right? So brains are made up of multiple regions which are responsible for multiple different brain functions, but it really looks like this squishy mass that you're going to get. And you've probably seen pictures of brains and a real brain, and you had very, very good questions about how the brain works and what determines intelligence and so on. So I'll take on that one. So who thinks that the bigger your brain, the smarter you are? No one? Everyone's shy? I mean, there are certain cases where you might think that the smaller brain might not be quite as functional, and so we make fun of these kinds of cartoons. But in fact, it's not just about the size of your brain, because if you look across a number of animal species, yes, the human brain is pretty impressive. It's very big compared to chimpanzee or a mouse down here, right, to scale. But there are other animals with larger brains, like the giraffe here, right? And so what other ideas might you have about this? Why would a giraffe have a larger brain? Any thoughts?
It has a larger head.
More of a head? Larger head?
Yeah.
Yeah, right? So that's one more sophisticated way to measure, right? So the ratio of the brain size to the body size. And in fact, humans carry around a very big brain for their small body size. Giraffe, of course, is much larger. But that still doesn't explain it fully, because there is a creature out there whose brain to body mass ratio is pretty high. So a dolphin's brain is actually larger than a human brain. And they're not that much bigger than we are. And so if you look at this, you might think, oh, well, maybe it's the number of folds in the brain, right? All wrinkled up like that. That makes us smarter in some way. But if you look at the dolphin brain, you see that it has many more folds. And so is that the answer of intelligence? In fact, it's very hard to pinpoint intelligence, right? But we have a sneaking suspicion that it's a reflection of something deeper, more microscopic than what we're showing you here. So these brains are filled with cells, right? What are brain cells called? Have you had brain cells, brain science? Yes?
Neurons.
Neurons, right. And so neurons are a particular type of cell, right? So a cell has a cell body usually, but neurons are special because they send out projections that are used to connect into circuits. And it's the complexity and the precision of those circuits, we think, that makes one brain more sophisticated than another, perhaps. And so here's some neurobiology for you. There's a cell body which sends information out along a process called the axon, and at the end it terminates in axon terminals. And this is the flow of information, right? This cell actually fires electrical signals which can move in one direction out to the axon terminals and make connections to other neurons. And it's the dendrites which receive those inputs at a structure called the synapse. And so these are some key words you should remember, that all neurons have this kind of cell body with projections that send information out, and projections which receive those inputs from other cells. This synapse is actually a gap, a small space, that allows signals to go across and then make this cell so happy that it will then send an electrical impulse out down to the other end and connect to the next cell. There's some other features here, like the red stuff, right? The red stuff here is made by other cells, not neural cells. They're called glial cells, and it's a kind of insulation. And it actually helps these long axons to propagate that electrical information. So if all this stuff is too complicated, I like to think of it as a much simpler model, like a plumbing system, right? So imagine your brain is a bunch of pipes that is transmitting water, hot water from one place to the next. And so you can have pipes, which are like axons. The water comes in one end and has to connect to another. And this gap is called the synapse. And I'd like to consider the synapse in this analogy as a valve of some kind. We can put on the insulation as well, so the water stays hot for longer distances. And then in the synapse, we have a valve. And this is important because the valve can be opened or closed. And in the next slide, I'm going to tell you a concept which is extremely important. The brain is not just a circuit that's wired up, but it can change. It changes with experience. Hopefully it's changing right now as you're listening to me. You're learning new things, and circuits are getting stronger or weaker. And this is a concept that is very important in neuroscience and in brain research, but I'm going to tell it to you in one simple slide using this plumbing analogy. Basically, brain plasticity comes in two flavors, right? So you can have a valve that's more open or more closed. And so that's a way in which you can make this connection stronger or weaker. Does that make sense? So you can have more water rushing through or less. And what turns the valve is experience. It changes the strength of the connection. But there's another kind of plasticity, which is much more dramatic. And this is something that's going on in your brains more so than in my brain, sadly. So it's a different kind of strengthening or weakening of connections, which we call structural. So in a structural plasticity, you take a circuit that's already wired up through the genes that made your brain in the first place, and then something much more dramatic happens. Certain synapses are pruned, axons are rerouted and make connections with new synapses to new circuits. So which one of these two types of plasticity do you think takes more effort? Yeah, it's a lot more work, right? You have to remove stuff and grow new things and then connect to other circuits which are hopefully there to receive the input. And so this sort of activity is easier to do, for example, if there are no insulating covers, right? You can strip this off faster. And in fact, these red insulators are coming on as your critical periods are closing. And so we're starting to learn a lot more about how the brain rewires itself. So let's take a real example from the real brain. If you study the visual system, input comes in through the eyes. It goes through an axon that makes one synapse here in the middle, deep in your brain, and then sends the information all the way to the back of your brain. So when you're looking at these slides, the back of your brain is lighting up and being activated. It turns out that this part of the brain is very plastic during the first 8 years of life. How many of you are taking German? No one, huh? All right, this is a slide from 1959 from a German scientist. But basically, your visual system is developing over several years after birth. And if something happens to your two eyes during that time, your brain can rewire in favor of the good eye, right? So I don't know if some of you have a lazy eye or know someone who had a lazy eye, right? That's a condition where the two eyes don't see the same thing at the same time. And your brain will rewire and, in fact, will look quite different. So if you look at the circuits, the connections made from the left eye or the right eye, you can label them in different colors, like black or white here. And in the back of your brain, normally these inputs arrive and share the same amount of space. So the black and white stripes connections are, in fact, about the same size. But if you grew up with a lazy eye, or one eye that didn't see very well, then the open or good eye will take over most of your visual cortex. So that's pretty dramatic. This is real brain science. It won the Nobel Prize for these folks at Harvard in 1981, and it was a real breakthrough in understanding why it is that vision gets weaker just by having a lazy eye. And you can understand that this kind of massive structural rewiring of the plumbing gets harder and harder to fix as we get older. And that's probably why there's still no cure for this condition. So if you want to understand how these circuits are made and connected, we really need to look at them in detail. And so at the Conti Center at Harvard, we have unbelievable tools coming online now. We can use fancy microscopes that dig even deeper and look at the very fine structure of neurons. And this is one of these machines. It's called an electron microscope. And what it does is it allows you to look at very thin sections of the brain, so thin, much thinner than a human hair, that you can then reconstruct and build up a three-dimensional rendering of the brain, a very, very small part of the brain. So now one section after another is being sliced off of this little piece of brain tissue, and then you can reconstruct what the real neurons look like. So here you have the orange is the dendrite receiving a blue axon or an input onto these cells. And so what you get is a very intricate map of neurons in the cortex, in the brain, and you see here just a very small cluster of these guys, each cell body sending a dendrite up and an axon down, and focus deeply onto just one dendrite of one cell, even one small portion of a dendrite like this. And all this colored stuff is other cells, other axon, other dendrites, which are making synapses onto this cell. Right? So if we just focus on this tiny little cylinder of brain tissue, which is so small that you could never see it with any other methods, you can then zoom in and look at what's in there, pull it apart, and you'll find that it's made up of many different things. So for example, the dendrites of other cells, or the axons of other cells, or those glial cells which put the myelin, or the insulation, around the axon. And so this is state-of-the-art neurobiology 2016. And with these techniques, we're hoping we can actually see circuits changing with experience, or disease, or recovery from an illness, or brain damage. And so just to give you a flavor of these synapses, each one of these blue arrows is pointing to a synapse, that small gap between the green or the red axon onto this gray dendrite. Right? And so this is no longer a cartoon, this is the actual brain and what it looks like. And so this is another view. The gray is the dendrite, and now you can see in transparent motif the axons with all the little yellow dots here, which is in fact the way in which signals are transmitted from the axon to the dendrite. All right, so that's a lot of detail. I'm going to step back and give you a little overview of the way experience builds these circuits, as you're going to do in a few minutes. And this is a video that is available from the National Scientific Council, and parents are welcome to look at this online. It's kept at the Harvard Center on the Developing Child.
A child's experiences during the earliest years of life have a lasting impact on the architecture of the developing brain. Genes provide the basic blueprint, but experiences shape the process that determines whether a child's brain will provide a strong or weak foundation for all future learning, behavior, and health. During this important period of brain development, billions of brain cells called neurons send electrical signals to communicate with each other. These connections form circuits that become the basic foundation of brain architecture. Circuits and connections proliferate at a rapid pace and are reinforced through repeated use. Our experiences and environment dictate which circuits and connections get more use. Connections that are used more grow stronger and more permanent. Meanwhile, connections that are used less fade away through a normal process called pruning. Well-used circuits create lightning-fast pathways for neural signals to travel across regions of the brain. Simple circuits form first, providing a foundation for more complex circuits to build on later. Through this process, neurons form strong circuits and connections for emotions, motor skills, behavioral control, logic, language, and memory during the early critical period of development. With repeated use, these circuits become more efficient and connect to other areas of the brain more rapidly. While they originate in specific areas of the brain, the circuits are interconnected. You can't have one type of skill without the others to support it. Like building a house, everything is connected, and what comes first forms a foundation for all that comes later.
So if experience early in life is so important in building up your brain, then you have to start to wonder what are good experiences or bad experiences. And so when you go home tonight, you should ask your parents what Calvin did here. Are you doing the right thing? The real question is why these critical periods happen at all. If brain plasticity and learning and changing your brain is so important, why does it happen early in life more than it does later in life? And we're starting to learn something about that too. And I'm not going to bore you with the details, except to say that just like plasticity, there are two types of neuron, essentially, excitatory and inhibitory cells. And we now have an idea which neurons are important for turning on these plastic windows. And because of this, in animals, we're able to delay or accelerate the time when these windows happen. And that's actually very important. It means that these windows of brain plasticity, critical periods, are not just set in stone, but you can actually maybe understand why someone born with a particular gene disorder or exposed to some kind of bad environment might have issues. But more importantly, it also gives us the possibility now to reopen a critical period in adults, right? So if you miss that early chance to fix your visual system, then maybe there's a day coming where we could maybe reopen this plastic time and use it as a therapy. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with these ideas. People have made movies about it, right? What if we had a pill or some way in which we could make our brains more plastic? And so in movies like Limitless, people are trying to find this mystery drug that will allow us to do it. But you should think about whether that's a good idea or not. The brain is a very complicated structure. I told you a little bit about vision, which is happening in the back of the brain. What happens if you make everything plastic all at once? There are so many parts of the brain that we don't yet know fully all of its functionality. But I thought it would be fun to end by talking about the last part of your brain to develop, which is the frontal lobe. So these are the four main parts of the brain. Maybe you can color it in on your brain later when you get them. But they're roughly responsible for different sensory and learning and memory events. So vision in the back of the brain, hearing and language down here, as well as visual memories, sensory integration in the parietal lobe, and this large area in the front of your brain, which will be developing well into your 20s. So you have quite a bit of development yet to go, and that's why we go to school, we go to college, and we use this time to really learn everything we can. So the frontal lobe is responsible for what we call executive function, which is a fancy word for controlling your emotions, controlling the right response in the right social setting. And so we'll do one last experiment here that probes the function of your frontal lobe, okay? There's no sound on this one, I think. And it's another psychology test that will require you to pay attention. I'll read the text on the way and do the test. You can shout it out if you want or do it in your head. So it's an effect called the Stroop effect. You can get this online too if you want to check it out later. And it tests your ability to control your response. So you're going to see a bunch of words, and the task is just to yell the color of the letters, right? So look at the next slide and just say the color of the letter. Red. Right. All right. It's going to get harder now. We'll do 20 slides. Ready? Blue. Red. Black. easier. Okay, so you guys just experienced the Stroop test. This was an experiment done in Germany over 100 years ago, and then brought into the English language by a fellow named Stroop in 1935. And what you experienced was what he showed at that time in adults, that it's much faster. Okay? Much faster to answer when the letters were not making any sense, when they were upside down, right? And when the letters were right side up and the colors didn't match the spelling of the word, then you had trouble. And it's your ability to inhibit the reaction to read those words instead of actually answering what color are the letters that is probing your executive function, your prefrontal cortex. And this is something that's still developing in all of you. As you get older, you'll be faster at doing this task, believe it or not. And it's a reflection of your frontal lobes really kicking in and maturing. And so I'm going to end by telling you how we are trying to probe prefrontal and frontal cortex. So if you want to go into the brain, it's very hard to do in humans. I showed you some images of language in the brain at the beginning. And we can use fancy machines like MRI machines that can make those scans. But the resolution of those machines is not that great, right? You get these big splotches of activity. And if the real meat of how the brain works is in the circuits and how they're connected, and you really need to reconstruct in those beautiful three-dimensional ways that I showed you, then we need to look in animal models, for example. It's also interesting to know how similar are animals to humans. Can we ask questions of animals that will probe how their brain works? So I don't know how many of you are taking Spanish. This is one of my favorite Larson Farsights. Scientists listening to the dolphins chattering away, and they can't figure out what they're saying. ¿Qué pasa? ¿Habla español? Okay, we have to be very observant. And in fact, you can start to be clever. So we know that animals like mice, they communicate too. And I don't know if you've ever heard a mouse speak, but they speak in ultrasound. So you probably can't hear that, even though your hearing is much better than mine. What you'll find is that they chatter away and they communicate like birds or humans might. This is what it sounds like if we shift the sound down to something you can hear. Sounds like a bird, right? Yeah. So you can make a spectrogram and look at the language of these animals. And you can actually test whether they like each other or not by designing a preference task, right? So what you're looking at here is a box, a pretty big box, which has little huts, little houses in the corners for the mice. And the red is a tracing of one animal, another animal in 4 different boxes. And if you put a mouse into a box, they do what mice do. They run around and they explore and go in and out of these little houses in the corners to see what's up. But after a while, they get used to it. And by 3 hours, they've decided they like it here, and they might sit in this box. Or they might still be exploring a little bit, but spend most of their time in one or the other box. This guy maybe fell asleep in this box, right? No longer coming out. And so in this way, you can test what do they prefer if, for example, you were playing the chatter of another mouse, or we could even use music and see if mice prefer a certain kind of music over silence or over other kinds of music. And so much like you might do with yourself, you expose yourself to music all the time. You like certain kinds of music. Mice like certain kinds of music, it turns out, if they've grown up listening to it. And so we found there's a critical period when mice will develop a preference for music. believe it or not. And so music is not something they usually hear. But if 2 weeks after birth, you let them hear music for 10 days, and then as an adult, test them in that arena, they will prefer to make a nest where the music is playing instead of the silence, right? And it's a real critical period because if you expose the animals as 2-month-old animals, they don't prefer the music. Mice generally prefer silence. And so it was very interesting that you can now reduce this sort of complicated behavior preference down to something simple that you could test in an animal. And it also showed that music makes the animals more calm. Because for a mouse to go through this central space is really nerve-wracking. They're exposed to potential predator or some kind of danger. But mice that develop a preference for music are more likely to cross the center than mice that don't have this. And it suggested where in the brain these changes might be happening. And of course, I'm telling you this because the changes are happening in the frontal part of the brain. More cells light up to the music that they grew up with than if they didn't develop a preference. And in fact, in all of us, it's very similar. So if you use that MRI technique and look in the front part of the brain, this is viewed from the left side, and then this is viewed from the inside in the middle. You could split the brain in half and look from the middle. You'll see that the very same part of the mouse brain is activated in the human brain when people are expressing a preference for a person or a thing. And a neat experiment that I found in the newspaper actually kind of corroborates this idea that there's a critical period for preference behavior. How many of you are on Facebook? Everybody knows Facebook? Some of you? All right. You can do an experiment like this where you look at the preference of people as adults for sports teams. How many of you are Red Sox fans? Everybody? Hopefully? Yes? Okay. All right. If you're not, then maybe you grew up in some other part of the country because these people found that preference for sports teams is very much shaped, especially in boys, if their team won a championship in the age range of 8 to 12. And so this is a time when your brain is developing interests and preferences that might be shaped for a lifetime. And so I want to end, before you go off and build your brain, and just answer 2 questions that came up in your questions about the brain. What happens that could damage the brain? And the most common question was about concussions, because we're talking about sports. I thought I'd give you a little video about what happens to your brain with a concussion. All of this beautiful circuitry that we've been talking about is housed inside your skull. And if it gets hit very hard, the brain has nowhere to go except to jiggle around inside your skull. And so, of course, that's going to have some consequences. So here's a cartoon version of the concussion.
This is a concussion. A concussion is a type of brain injury. You can't see it. You may not have a bump, a bruise, or even a scratch on your head. All that has to happen for you to get a concussion is for your brain to move around inside your skull. You don't even have to get hit on the head. A jolt or hard slam to your body can make your brain bounce back and forth against the inside of your skull. Getting a concussion doesn't always mean you get knocked out. Less than 1 in 10 people who get a concussion ever lose consciousness. And you can get a concussion in any sport or physical activity, even skateboarding, biking, or snowboarding. The number of sports and recreation concussions every year could be as high as 3.8 million. That's more than the total number of hairs on every monkey ever shot into space in the last 50 years. So what do you do if you feel like you've got a concussion? You could have symptoms like confusion, headache, dizziness, nausea, fatigue, or a general foggy feeling, like your brain has a bad Wi-Fi connection. It's important to report it to your coach, your athletic trainer, your parents, or even a teammate right away. Otherwise, you may end up like Mike. Mike played football. Mike was the team's star player. But after he got a concussion, he continued to play as if he was okay. bad idea. Since then, things got kind of funny. He thought he was fine, but Mike started having headaches and had a hard time doing the things he used to do, like playing video games. Mike should have told his coach, athletic trainer, or parent and got himself out of the game right away. If you think you may have had a concussion, it's important to see a doctor or a medical professional with experience in sports concussion and not return to activities until they say it's okay. Your brain needs to rest in order to heal. If you don't rest, you could wind up like Jessica. Jessica was an all-star softball player, straight A's, busy social life. In her last game, Jessica slid headfirst into home plate, and her coach took her out of the game because she thought she got a concussion. But she didn't make the right decisions after the game. She didn't get checked out by a healthcare professional, tell her parents about her symptoms, or take the time to rest her mind and her body. Pretty soon, things got weird for her too. Her social life suffered and she started to forget things, like her date with her boyfriend. So if you don't recognize a concussion, report the symptoms, and take the time to rest, you could miss out on a lot in school, in sports, and in your social life. Concussions can make you moody too. You might get angry, cry, or act just plain weird for no reason. And you may not even enjoy doing the things you used to like doing. Take the time to rest up completely after a concussion. That may mean no driving, TV, internet, texting, or video games. It's not fun, but it will get you better faster. So, if you think you might have a concussion, remember to 1. Recognize. Know the symptoms and signs of concussion for yourself and your teammates. 2. Report. Tell your coach, athletic trainer, or parents about your symptoms. Get out of the game. Staying in could make it worse for you and your team. And 3. Rest. That means taking time off from sports, your usual activities, and maybe even schoolwork until your doctor or other medical professional says it's okay. But don't worry. Your teammates will step up while you're out, and your teachers can help you. Check out the website for more info on how to get over a concussion and get back in the game.
Okay, so concussion is obviously bad for your brain. Don't hit your head. But if it happens, make sure you make parents and teachers aware of it so you can take care of it. It's especially important for your frontal cortex. It's the longest, most plastic part of your brain, well into your 20s, as I told you. Yeah? Can you hear?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. I want to end with my last slide, which sets us up for the game you're going to play. It's not just a hit to the head that can damage your circuitry. Stress can also be very bad, especially for the prefrontal cortex. We all know about stress. There are positive aspects of stress. In fact, if you're being chased by a bear, you want that stress to drive you into action, right? It drives your heart rate, it makes you escape from danger. There are other forms of stress which you can tolerate. So if you have a good, warm, healthy family life, that can support you during tough times, like you have exams that are tough to get through and you have to deal with them, but you're not on your own. Unfortunately, there are cases of toxic stress, and that's a topic that you'll hear more about in the breakout session in a minute. This is a condition where you don't have that kind of support, and unfortunately, this has been shown to affect brain development. And brain development, topic of today, is so important for the rest of your life that we want to make sure we can avoid any kind of physical damage like a concussion or toxic stress that you might not see, but definitely your brain is feeling. So this is an intro to the game you're going to play, and it's about building a brain.
These ordinary people are building brains. It takes a little bit of skill, a little bit of luck, and a lot of teamwork. As you build a brain, you're going to learn how environments, experiences, and genes act together to shape brain development. Ready? It's the brain architecture game. Before we start playing, let's learn some brain science. To help with that, we'll need a scientist.
Our topic today is the brain. We often think of the brain as just one thing, but really, it's like a lot of little brains, all inside one organ. Just like a house with many rooms, each room has a different function. Brain cells are the building material. What happens is that experiences you have cause brain cells to connect together, like a house that's getting wired up. Basic sensory abilities like vision and hearing are the first to get wired up, and these act like a foundation for other abilities to be built on. As you age, the right experiences build new rooms. You learn how to walk and talk, and eventually how to do more complex things like arithmetic and planning and reasoning. These last rooms are still getting wired up in your teens and beyond, and that's great news because it means that parents, teachers, coaches, and all of us who spend time with kids can influence the development of these abilities right into a person's 20s. But it's all built on the foundation that began in the earliest years.
So, what's going on inside the brain that causes certain abilities to develop in some people and not in others?
This is where experiences really matter. Genes provide the basic instructions to tell cells to connect to each other, but it's experiences, like all that time spent on peekaboo, learning to read, or just playing together, that cause certain circuits to be wired and strengthened during development. Wiring that's used less does not become as strong, and it gets pruned away. So it's up to caregivers and communities to make sure young people have positive brain-building experiences at all ages of their development. Of course, not all kinds of experiences are helpful. Really bad experiences that are intense, frequent, or prolonged, like violence, ongoing neglect, cause stress that's so serious it can have a toxic effect on brain development. A brain experiencing toxic stress will have weaker architecture, and that can lead to a whole range of problems later in life. Sometimes we have experiences that could turn toxic for the brain or not, depending on who's around to give support. Imagine a tragedy like death of a parent. A child left to grieve without adult support will suffer severe stress that lasts a long time. But if caring adults work with the child to soothe the body's stress response and teach coping skills, the experience won't be toxic for the brain. When caregivers prevent severe stress experiences from turning toxic, scientists call it tolerable stress. So, communities and caregivers are very important, whether they're actively encouraging healthy brain development or working to prevent toxic stress from harming the brain. These interventions are very important for the long-term health and well-being of both individuals and the community as a whole. That last point is what I want you to think about when you play the brain architecture game, because as you'll learn soon enough, brains don't build themselves. It's group work, so get all the help you can and go build some brains.
Okay, newly educated brain experts, are you ready to play? Your goal in the brain architecture game is to build your brain as tall as possible. You want a strong brain too, so it won't collapse under the weight of life's stresses. To play the game, you'll need pipe cleaners, supports, they kind of look like straws, a die, weights, life experience cards, and a life journal. The game starts, as life does, with a roll of the dice. What's your genetic starting point? Roll the die and check your life journal. Then, build the corresponding base. Next, you need to find out the number of social supports you have at birth. Roll the die again and collect that number of supports to use later in the game. Mark the results of both rolls on your life journal. Now that your brain is born, life happens. For each year, you'll draw 3 life experience cards. Their effect on your brain can be positive, toxic, or tolerable, which determines the materials you have to build with. Each time you draw a card, it's important to keep track of what type of experience it is in your life journal. How do life experiences affect brain architecture? If you draw a positive experience, you'll collect a pipe cleaner and a straw as building materials. Because positive experiences, like learning a new skill, are the building blocks of strong brain architecture. What happens when you draw a toxic stress experience card? It's bad news for your brain because it weakens architecture. Whenever you draw a toxic stress experience, you get a pipe cleaner, but no straw. Sorry. If you draw a question mark card, you may or may not get a support. Add up your life experiences in the game so far. If you've had more positive than toxic experiences, take a straw with your pipe cleaner. If you've had a pileup of toxic stress, you probably aren't getting the caregiver support you need, so no straw for you. If it's a tie or if this is your first life experience card, roll the die. Even rolls mean positive. Odd rolls mean toxic. As you build your brain, keep in mind a few do's and don'ts. Do use all the materials you've collected in a year before moving on to the next year. Do attach pipe cleaners at the ends. Build closed structures at the end of each year. Don't leave open ends to tie up later. Okay, did you get all that? Positive experiences earn a pipe cleaner and straw. Toxic stress earns just a pipe cleaner. Tolerable experiences turn positive or toxic, depending on the balance of experiences in the game so far. Your brain saw some pretty remarkable changes from birth until the end of year 5. From here, the pace of development slows and the rules change, just as they do in life. Starting in year 6, you can't earn any additional straws. Your base is already built, but your brain is still developing. So now, a positive experience earns just a pipe cleaner, and a toxic stress earns a weight. Attach each weight to the tallest point on your brain. Tolerable stress turns positive or toxic, like before. The game ends when your brain finishes year 8, or collapses, or tips over, whichever comes first. Remember, the goal is to build the strongest, tallest brain you can. Work together, have fun, and once you've finished, talk with your group about what happened to your brain.
All right, so we're going to play. So cherish your brain, protect it, and have fun.
You have a really good aunt or you have a really good teacher that cares about you, and so you can use those whenever you want. Yeah.
But then we only got like. We got to do 7. Oh yeah, we're on 7.
After 6.
Scientists over here, this is a great finding, right? That when you're younger, you need a lot more support. As you get older and you start to be able to do things on your own, things are different.